I recently returned from Tucson, lucky enough to have scheduled a trip to the 25% of the United States that was not experiencing a polar vortex. I was there for our annual Trust retreat, and Trust is an organization of UU trans religious professionals. And I had to leave a little earlier than some of my colleagues, so I arranged for a car to come pick me up. And as I was climbing into the back seat of the car, the driver said, "Well, come on and sit up here, hon, if you want." So I got in the front seat, and we had a lovely conversation all the way to the airport, an hour away. She shared with me her life in Tucson, where her and her husband had moved after they retired. We talked about Vermont, and I gave her some tips on traveling to Vermont and vacationing there, because apparently going to Vermont, where I live, was on her bucket list. We talked about my kids and the hobbies that they had. And then when we arrived at the airport, just as I was about to get out of the car, she said to me, "What's your name again?" "Andrea?" And I said, "Oh, Andre." She said, "Andrea?" And there it was. The question underneath a question that I encounter quite a lot in my life. And it made me pause and rethink that entire car trip. How had she perceived me? As a woman? As a man? As something in between? See, each day, every single one of us, we're confronted with situations or decisions that press against us, and they shift how others perceive us. For some of us, those shifts are more conscious and possibly more challenging than for others. Individuals who are biracial, for example, might confront perceptions about their race depending on their social circumstances, identifying as black, for example, with one social group and perhaps white with another. Those who grow up in multi-faith households are often trying to make decisions about two different faith traditions. So let's say Jewish and Christian, maybe not really feeling like they belong to either one. Because each of us holds complex and deeply personal aspects of our identity that are public and private, visible and invisible. And today, what I'd like to explore is gender, as an example of just one of those identities that our society tends to frame in a very strict binary of two polar opposites, male and female, as if there's absolutely no space in between. We already heard in that video of Lee McCovey an expression of how it feels to be himself in that in-between space. His family and his friends insist how he should be in his own body. His mother fears his future because of who he is, yet he does not hate himself. Describing his own experience in his body, he says, "I just love it enough to let it go. I treat it like a house, and when your house is falling apart, you do not evacuate. You make it comfortable enough to house all your insides. You make it pretty enough to invite guests over. You make the floorboards strong enough to stand on." This poem gives language to his courage, his act of rising up against the message that the world delivers to him. Despite that message, he insists that his gender, his identity, and his body is whole and sacred. And he knows the danger of so many that are inhabiting that space. He says, "I wonder how long it will be before trans suicide notes start to feel redundant, before we realize that our bodies become lessons about sin way before we learn how to love them." Now, these are Lee McCovey's words, his experiences and his journey. I personally hold some more mundane experiences living in this in-between space, as I shared in my example of my car ride in Tucson. And another example from a few summers ago, I was in Chautauqua, New York, and I was waiting to enter a concert at an outdoor amphitheater. For those of you that have been there, you can get week-long passes to all the events that go on there. So a number of us had IDs around our necks that were our passes to get into the amphitheater. And as we stood in line, each one of us moved forward, and there was a staff member who used a scanner to scan the barcode on our IDs. And as they did so, the person at the front of the line was greeting every single person. Good evening, sir. Beep. Good evening, ma'am. Beep. Good evening, sir. Beep. Good evening, ma'am. Beep. It was like we were in some weird science fiction assembly line in some factory that only made 2 models, one male and one female. And my anxiety, I found, was growing as I got closer to the front of that line. It was a beautiful summer evening, and I was dressed to enjoy myself. I had on my purple sunglasses, nail polish, my capris, my favorite pair of flats, a purple pink top. And all those clothes that I proudly wore, I purchased in a department labeled women's, even though I was born and spent most of my life having other people consider me to be male. And I don't consider myself a man, yet I'm not a woman either. I live somewhere in between, and I simply refer to myself as trans. Good evening, sir. Beep. Good evening, ma'am. Beep. Good evening, sir. How is this person going to address me when I got to the front of that line? Now, by trans, I am purposely using a very broad term that encompasses many identities, including transgender identities where an individual has transitioned from one binary gender to another, such as male to female, but that's not my trans identity. I am personally not transitioning to be a woman, and if I want to be more specific with my language, I might refer to myself as genderqueer, or I might describe myself as non-binary trans feminine. And I recognize that much of this language may be foreign to many of you, such as my pronouns, they, them, and theirs. Because English hasn't really provided us a lot of options to describe gender, so many of us have gotten creative with the words that we use to describe ourselves and express ourselves and to assert our identity in the world. But so much of our day-to-day interactions as trans folks just present us with these 2 options. Good evening, sir. Beep. Good evening, ma'am. Beep. And in these situations, we wonder, will our identity be seen and acknowledged, or will we remain invisible? And we wonder about our emotional and physical safety if our identity is revealed in a place where we don't feel safe. So I'm gonna leave me standing there in that line, my fabulous purple summer outfit, but we'll be back, I promise. Because the response that I received that evening is important to our conversation today. In the meantime, I want to zoom in to that in-between space, that space between the 2 binary choices. And looking at this space, I find that the work of artist Io Tillett-Wright is helpful here. Io is an artist and photographer, and in a TED Talk from 2013, Io describes growing up in Greenwich Village, New York, and working as a child actor, living and acting as a boy, even though Io was assigned female at birth. As an adult, while Proposition 8 and the debate of marriage equality gained media attention, Io came to a realization. Io said in their TED Talk, I had spent a year photographing this new generation of girls, much like myself, who kind of fell in between the lines. girls who skateboarded but did it in lacy underwear, girls who had boys' haircuts but wore girly nail polish, girls who had eyeshadow that matched their scraped knees, girls who liked girls and boys who all liked boys, and girls who all hated being boxed into anything. I loved these people, and I admired their freedom, but I watched as the world outside our utopian bubble exploded into these raging debates where pundits started likening our love to bestiality on national television, and this powerful awareness rolled over me that I was a minority, and in my own home country, based on one facet of my character. I was legally and indisputably a second-class citizen. And this realization of Io's is what led to a project named Self-Evident Truth. And Io set out to photograph people like him, people who did not identify as 100% straight, to visibly highlight their humanity. And you can go onto the project's website still, and you can see faces and stories from 10,000 people across the US. Io said, self-evident truth doesn't erase the differences between us. In fact, on the contrary, it highlights them. It presents not just the complexities found in a procession of different human beings, but the complexities found in each and every individual person. And Io refers to this spectrum of complexity as the gray. And the gray that Io discusses is not just about sexual preferences, it's gender identity, it's gender expression, it's the whole spectrum of what makes up our identity as individual and whole human beings. And without projects like Io's, without stories and faces that make up the visible truth of the non-binary, we are only left with limited options that repeatedly make people invisible. Good evening, sir. Beep. Good evening, ma'am. Beep. Without acknowledging the humanity in another person, we commit an act of harm, even if it's not intentional. Another artist, Lana Wachowski, describes the harm she experienced when her true self had been invisible. You may be familiar with Lana's work. Her and her sibling are the directors and creators behind the Matrix trilogy, and most recently the series Sense8. Lana, a transgender woman, received the Human Rights Campaign's Visibility Award in 2012, and in her acceptance speech, she recalls an incident from the 3rd grade. She'd moved from a public school to a Catholic school, and she said, "In public school, I played mostly with the girls. I have long hair and everyone wears jeans and t-shirts. In Catholic school, the girls wear skirts, the boys play pants. I'm told I have to cut my hair. I want to play foursquare with the girls, but now I'm one of them. I'm one of the boys. Early on, I'm told to get in line after the morning bell. Girls in one line, boys in another. I walk past the girls feeling this strong gravity of association, yet some part of me knows that I have to keep on walking. As soon as I look toward the other line, though, I feel a feeling of differentiation that confuses me. I don't belong there either. I stop between them. The nun realizes this and is staring at me. She's shouting at me, and I don't know what to do. She grabs me, she's yelling at me. I'm trying not to disobey. I'm just trying to fit in. My silence infuriates her, and she starts to hit me. And by coincidence, Lana's mother happens to witness this event and intervenes, rescuing her. And I think I'm safe, Lana says. But then she takes me home, and she's trying to understand what happened, but I have no real language to describe it. I just stare at the floor, and she keeps asking me over and over again what happened. And I begin feeling that same mounting frustration, the same mounting fury that I felt with the nun. She tells me to look at her, but I do not want to, because when I do, I'm unable to understand why she cannot see me. When you are living in the gray, it takes courage to continually struggle every single day to be visible. Often you don't have the words or expression to articulate the core of who you are, because so much of our language, so much of our mental constructs are designed without any recognition whatsoever that you exist. And there is a type of societal violence against the soul in this denial of existence. And it can be fatal. Wachowski speaks of this violence in her acceptance speech. Invisibility is indivisible from visibility, she says. Invisibility is indivisible from visibility. For the transgender, this is not simply a philosophical conundrum. It can be the difference between life and death. For those of us living in the gray, navigating the shores between visibility and invisibility, it's a daily practice of showing up in moments large and small. Filling out a form that only offers 2 boxes. Using a public bathroom. Hearing someone use your incorrect pronoun. Experiencing someone calling you it. Having a store clerk direct you to the clothing department for another gender as if you were lost. Having a service person completely ignore you, and then as you speak to them, and then begrudgingly assist you while trying their best not to look at you. Having a TSA agent tell you your body is an anomaly and then publicly patting you down in the security line. And if any of these experiences, any of these stories that I'm sharing with you today, if there's anyone here where these stories resonate deeply with you and part of your identity, know that you are whole, you are beautiful, and you are sacred. How could anyone ever tell you you were anything less than beautiful? How could anyone ever tell you you were less than whole? How could anyone fail to notice that your loving is a miracle? How deeply you're connected to my soul. A few years ago, I had to fill out a form to register for a retreat. And on the second page of that form, I encountered a question. How would you identify your gender? And then a blank line. No boxes, no limits. I could write down whatever I wanted. So I put down the form for like an hour as I went around the house, distracting myself with laundry and dishes, thinking, what am I going to write on this line? No limits, nothing that had been predetermined for me. Because there's more than just 2 models of human being available. Good evening, sir. Beep. Good evening, ma'am. Beep. There's an infinite spectrum of humanity, and it's one that I prefer to refer to as a rainbow rather than gray. And incidentally, I need to share with you what happened to me when I got to the front of that line, because what happens points to another aspect of courage that I want to lift up today. And that's the courage that each and every one of us is called to in this world. So I got to the front of that line and my heart was racing a little bit. I was hoping, between the two options that the staff person would choose, ma'am, just maybe, but I wasn't sure. That was the best case scenario in my head, at least. But they lifted up the scanner. They looked me directly in the eye. And they said, "Good evening." Beep. And I smiled back, knowing that nobody else around me really understood what this small exchange of dignity meant for me that evening. It's good evening. No attempt to categorize me. No fumbling guesses. Just plain good evening. And this is where communal courage begins. And we need communal courage. We need communal courage in Unitarian Universalism. Our welcoming congregation program is over 30 years old, having started in 1989, and since then, over 75% of UU congregations have taken part in that program, creating more welcoming spaces for LGBTQ individuals. Yet, Trust, the organization that I'm part of, recently ran a survey. And we ran a survey of UU trans individuals and found that the vast majority of them don't feel completely included and welcome as trans individuals in their congregations. They experience trans marginalization in UU spaces. And they don't feel nourished and connected in the congregations where they exist. That's a big gap between what our welcoming congregation programs promises and where it is. And as a faith tradition, we can do so much better for our trans siblings. The Trust website gives specific things that actions you can take as a congregation to support trans individuals in your own congregation and within Unitarian Universalism. And each and every single one of us can do our part every single day. And we can do that by offering blank lines, not boxes, by abandoning gender-specific language, unless you're 100% certain of a person's gender identity. Let go of male, female, husband, wife. Get into the habit of asking for pronouns. Don't make assumptions. Because for any person, no matter what aspect of their identity, race, class, gender, sexuality, ability, faith, assume that the reality of their lived and complex experiences are much more than you can imagine from your own complex and multi-layered experience. To embrace the whole rainbow spectrum of humanity, because this is an act of nonviolence. This is an act of grace. And life will be richer for all of us.